Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you, Jerry. The theme is indeed leadership, as we all know over these last 3 days. This fellow that just introduced me, Stead, is not only one of, but may be the most successful business leader in America. Just one little fact you may not know. 10 years ago, as CEO, he brought his IHS company public. The share price about 10 years ago that we went public at was $16 a share. Friday it closed at $135 a share. There's just no better record. I was kind of thinking that the leadership theme was something that really struck home, because as I started my career, I taped something on my briefcase, and it stayed with me through thick and thin through about a 53-year career. And the sentence kind of helped me keep a balance, because everything, of course, didn't always go right. And that philosophy on the briefcase was that the ultimate test of leadership is not the press or the popularity, but the risks that you take. And yes, risk can spell defeat. But I would submit that the greatest defeat would be to live without the courage to take risk, for that would hardly be living at all. And why that had maybe such an impact on me is just like you. When you grow up and the life you've lived, it's something that stays with you as you evolve your life. And I'll never forget growing up in the inner city of Detroit, Michigan. My parents moved when I was in elementary school, and the new school that I went to had on the south a residential neighborhood, and on the north, projects. And the projects had gangs, and the gangs liked to pick fights with new residential kids. Coming home pretty beaten up one day, my mom came up to my room. She sat down on the bed with me and she said, "You know, Mike, you just must be tough enough to never give up." And she got up and left. And I felt I can never let her down. And I never lost another fight. When I then went off and entered the 5,000 student high school, I was also determined to try out for the freshman football team. The coach took one look at my 5'6", 126-pound frame and refused to offer me a uniform to try out. I was just devastated. Sure enough, that night, I'll never forget it, my mom came up to my room again, and we made a plan. She would feed me 5 meals a day, and I would lift weights in the garage 5 nights a week. 2 years later, in my junior year, at that time then 6 foot, 184 pounds, I made the team, was captain in my senior year, and earned a football scholarship at Miami of Ohio. However, in my sophomore year, I got injured, and it required a nice big steel plate in the shoulder. No more football, no more scholarship. At the same time, my father's business went bankrupt. I became a college dropout, and I worked 6 nights a week on the docks of Detroit, loading and unloading boxcars and ships. And after a year, I had enough money to re-enroll. And 3 years later, graduating with a degree in business, I was ready to get a job. But some may recall back then it was 1961, and the economy had slipped into a tough recession. The companies all canceled their interviews on campus. But I had 3 things on my balance sheet. I had a degree, I had some debt, and I had a new sport coat. So I put the degree in my pocket and the sport coat on my back, and I hitchhiked from Oxford, Ohio to Indianapolis, Indiana, so I could get an interview with the IBM branch office. And that was the beginning of a 31-year IBM career. When I look back at all that, my mom really did teach me I had to be tough enough to never give up. But looking forward to the business world, the briefcase philosophy that the ultimate test of leadership is your courage to take risks that, put together with my mom's philosophy, made a lot of sense. A few cases in point. At the IBM company, I had been promoted to an executive position at corporate headquarters in Armstrong, New York. After a presentation to the board, I was asked a question by Mr. Tom Watson, honorary chairman and the son of the founder of IBM. But it was a question that I needed to go back and do some homework and study and get back to him. When I had that answer, I asked my secretary to call his office and find out where he was so I could give him a phone call. What I didn't know, assume nothing, is that Mr. Watson had decided to have all his calls forwarded. So he picked up the phone. When I then picked up the phone, he was absolutely insulted and enraged that I had not placed that call to him directly, and he had talked to the secretary first. I just never got to explain that my secretary was calling him, his office, so I could find the number and the place to call him. The reason I never got a chance to explain that is that he got so mad that he fired me and hung up the phone. I went home. As you can imagine, I didn't sleep too well that night and was trying to figure out, did I have the courage to go back into the office the next morning and face the humiliation of being fired by the son of the founder of the business? Or should I just call a headhunter and get on with life? Right or wrong, I mustered up the courage and I went back to the office. It was about 7:30, and I sat down. Phone rang immediately. It was Tom Watson. He stated that he was completely out of order, ashamed of his outburst. I was not fired. And would I come over to his house that afternoon for lunch? You can imagine my response. I immediately accepted, had a wonderful lunch. After lunch, I bought his motorcycle. We rode together, and we became very good friends. Back in the early 90s, I was the CEO of Hughes Electronics and Aerospace. 95% of our business was defense. We made satellites, radars, missiles, electronics. The Cold War was raging. The defense budgets were escalating. But then, to the surprise of the world, the Soviet Union collapsed, and so did America's defense budget. Our revenues went into precipitous decline, and we laid off tens of thousands of people. However, we had a satellite research and development project that was in the back room. It was called Direct TV, but it required some big-time risk. The risk of $1 billion in cash outlay up front, the risk of a defense company going into digital television from the sky, and the risk of developing a national retail chain to not only sell the dish on your roof, but the programming in your living room. It was an enormous risk. We took it. And 25 years later, DirecTV has exceeded all our expectations. Another tough risk confronted me at AT&T around the turn of the century. The long-distance business was in systemic decline. Competition was fierce. It was fierce on price. It was fierce on margin. It was fierce on shareholder return. One day, I got a message from a competitor out west. The competitor said that he was going to book local exchange contracts up front instead of accounting for them over the life of the contract. Of course, you know what that would do. That would take all the profit and the revenue up front on the contract. Shareholder value would go up. Stock price would go up. In fact, when they announced it, their stock price climbed dramatically. We didn't think that sounded like a good risk because the accounting standards back then did not allow that as a standard accounting practice. So we said no. Subsequently, the CEO was convicted with a 10-year jail sentence. As a postscript, today, several decades later, if you've been following it in the newspapers, AT&T and DirecTV are going to merge with the appropriate approvals. So, ladies and gentlemen, as you recall our time together, I hope from the stories that I've shared and the experiences that leadership indeed is the courage to take risk and be tough enough to never give up. As I learned from being beaten up in grade school to being fired from IBM, it always ain't going to be easy. But it always should be the best that you've got every time you've got a chance to give. If I could leave you with a thought, as students think about going forward, and it's a thought that I read in a play called Merrily We Roll Along. and it goes like this. We are standing on the threshold of the future. We got to be the luckiest people who ever lived. Do you guys realize that now we're going to be able to do anything we ever dreamed of? What a time to be starting out. What a time to be alive. Good luck, and thank you.